Hello friends, my name is Nizamuddin Ahmed Siddiqui and I am Assistant Professor of Law at West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata. The present module entitled Detention, Torture and Rights of Prisoners of War, which is part 1 of the discussion. The learning outcomes of the present module include: number 1, to give students an overview of the necessity for protection of prisoner of war. Number 2, to acquaint students with an understanding of international human rights law on prisoner of war. Friends, let us begin with a discussion on the issue of prisoner of war. The use of the phrase prisoner of war can be traced to 1660. This phrase is used for an individual who may or may not be a combatant in an armed conflict and is captured by the enemy. Prisoners of war are held to isolate them from enemy combatants still in the field, to release and repatriate them in an orderly manner after hostilities. It usually demonstrated military victory. Prisoner of wars or POWs were punished, prosecuted for war crimes and exploited for their labor. They became means to collect military and political intelligence and were indoctrinated in new political or religious beliefs. This module traces the treatment of prisoner of war throughout history and the need and evolution of the protection of their human rights. Let us trace the history on treatment of prisoner of war. Let us first see pre-World Wars situation. In the early history of warfare, there was no recognition of a status of prisoner of war. Those captured, irrespective of whether they were a combatant or not, were either killed or enslaved by their captor. The women, children and elders of the defeated tribe or nation were frequently disposed of in similar fashion. The availability of food and usefulness of a prisoner were the driving force for the captor to keep a captive alive. However, such prisoners were considered as a movable property or a chattel owned by his captor. During religious wars, it was generally considered a virtue to put non-believers to death. For example, in the 13th century Albigensian crusade and the Northern Crusades, when asked by a crusader how to distinguish between the Catholics and Cathars once they had taken the city of Béziers, the papal legate Arnaud Almaric famously replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Although in the time of the campaigns of Julius Caesar, a captive could, under certain circumstances, become a freedman within the Roman Empire. The treatment of prisoners of war changed as warfare changed with time. During the Middle Ages, there was a decline in enslaving the enemy soldiers. However, ransoming of the prisoners was still popularly practiced even as late as 17th century. The captives were sometimes a burden on their captor. Thus, the civilians of the defeated party were infrequently taken as prisoner. For instance, during Childeric's siege and blockade of Paris in 464, the nun Genevieve, later canonized as the city's patron saint, pleaded with the Frankish king for the welfare of prisoners of war and met with a favorable response, and Clovis I later liberated captives after Genevieve urged him to do so. By the 16th and early 17th centuries, some European political and legal philosophers expressed their thoughts about the amelioration of the effects of capture upon prisoners. Hugo Grotius advocated in his De Jure Belli S. Pacis 1625, translated as On the Law of War and Peace, for exchange and ransom of prisoners, even though he believed that the victors had the right to enslave their enemies. A notion of minimal destruction of property and life during the war was being formed. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, established the rule that prisoners of war should be released without ransom at the end of hostilities and that they should be allowed to return to their homelands. In the 18th century, the national as well as international laws started to envelop a sense of morality which had a huge impact upon the problems of prisoner of war. The prisoners were exchanged during the American Revolutionary War and Napoleonic Wars from 1793 to 1815, followed by the Anglo-American War of 1812 to reduce the number of prisoners and also alleviating shortage of skilled personnel in the home country. Prisoner of war camps were built to house the prisoners. The earliest known purposely built prisoner of war camp was established at Norman Cross, England in 1797 to house the increasing number of prisoners from the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. It was intended to be a model depot providing the most humane treatment of prisoners of war. The French political philosopher Montesquieu in his L'Esprit des Lois 1748, often translated as the spirit of laws, wrote that the only right in war that the captor had over a prisoner was to prevent him from doing harm. He argued that a prisoner should not be treated as a property by the captor, but should only be removed from the battle. Other writers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Émeric de Watteau expanded on the same theme and developed what might be called the quarantine theory for the disposition of prisoners. The Western world started to recognize the principles of treatment of prisoners of war by the mid-19th century. Initially, at the start of the American Civil Wars in 1861 to 1865, captives were kept in the camps, but were still paid, though not allowed to perform military duties, and agreed not to fight until they were officially exchanged. However, this system collapsed because in 1864 the Confederacy Generis of Ulysses S. Grant refused to recognize former slaves serving as African American soldiers in the Union Army, and by the end of the war about 56,000 of the 409,000 prisoners of war died in prisons, accounting for nearly 10% of the conflict's fatalities. The failure to maintain the principles during the American Civil War and the Franco-German War of 1870-71 led to numerous attempts in the latter half of the century to improve the processing and treatment of the prisoner. This led to emergence of a series of international conventions. In 1874, a conference at Brussels agreed to prevent inhumane treatment of the prisoners and excessive or unnecessary use of force to harm them, but it was not ratified. In 1899 and again in 1907, international conferences at The Hague drew up rules of conduct that gained some recognition in international law. Chapter 2 of the Annex to the 1907 Hague Convention 4, the laws and customs of war on land, covered the treatment of prisoners of war in detail. These provisions were further expanded in the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Prisoners of War and were largely revised in the Third Geneva Convention in 1949. Friends, let us discuss the scenario of prisoners of war during the World Wars. The events of the two world wars had a profound effect on international law due to the widespread denial of civil rights and liberties on the basis of racial, religious and political discrimination. The systematic use of violence, including wanton murder and ultimately genocide, the use of slave labor, abuse and murder of prisoners of war, widespread deportations and confiscation of property forced changes to the status quo. By the end of World War I, around 8 million people had surrendered and were held in prisoners of war camps. Around 2.5 million of them were held by Germany. Russia held 2.9 million. Britain and France held around 720,000 and US held 48,000. Germans from the start of the war had taken in large volume of prisoners. In September 1914, 125,050 French soldiers and 94,000 Russian ones were held captive. They had made no preparations for holding large numbers of captives. Most of their prisoner of war camps were hastily established and were in the main inadequate in every way. The goal to maximize the number of installations in haste gave rise to problems of hygiene and illness. By the summer of 1915, working camps had been established and men were sent to labor in mines, forests, factories and farms. The basic construction of the camp created the problems of toilets and unbreathable atmosphere. Thus, diseases like typhus or cholera affected the camps quickly. In February 1915, the camp at Chemnitz was placed under quarantine. One prisoner wrote that the only vehicles approaching the camp were those transporting coffins. A confinement that was visual as well as physical very quickly led to psychological illnesses among the prisoners. Illnesses generally grouped under the heading of barbed wire psychosis or prisoner's syndrome. Cases of epilepsy, madness and suicides undergone in the camps were because of the physical and or moral persecutions. Falling afoul of camp rules exposed a prisoner to sanctions, which could come about for various reasons. Refusal to salute, refusal to answer during roll call, insubordination, possession of banned objects like paper, wearing clothes, escape or attempted escape. Various forms of detention were executed. Locking up the prisoner for weeks or attaching to post with hands behind his back, and had to remain in this position, which prevented him from moving for a certain amount of time without eating or drinking. Amidst the dim living conditions, the prisoners were allowed to receive as well as send mails or parcels. Even libraries and placed for religious practices opened in most camps by the end of October 1915. The prisoners captured by the Ottoman Empire were weak and starved when they surrendered, and 4,250 died in captivity. The prisoners of war in Turkish camps, except for officers, were treated particularly harshly. The Australian prisoners captured during Sinai and Palestine campaign in 1915 were forced to march and crowded railway journeys preceded years in camps where disease, post-diet and inadequate medical facilities prevailed. The prisoners that survived the camps were exchanged at the end of the war. While the Allied prisoners were sent home at the end of the war, the same treatment was not granted to Central Powers prisoners of the Allies and Russia, many of which had to serve as forced labor, for example in France until 1920. They were released after many approaches by the International Committee of Red Cross and the Allied Supreme Council. Soon after the war, the nations of the world gathered at Geneva to devise the Convention of 1929, which before the outbreak of World War II was ratified by France, Germany, Great Britain, the United States and many other nations, but not by Japan or the Soviet Union. The most important innovations consisted in the prohibition of reprisals and collective penalties, the organization of prisoners' work, the designation by the prisoners of representatives and the control exercised by protecting powers. During World War II, millions of persons were taken prisoner under widely varying circumstances and experienced treatment that ranged from excellent to barbaric. The treatment of prisoners was supposed to be governed by the Geneva Convention 1929, signed by major Western powers such as Britain, US, Italy and Germany. Japan had signed but not ratified it and thus did not treat its prisoners according to the international agreement. The Japanese treated their British, American and Australian prisoners of war harshly, and only about 60% of these POWs survived the war. The armies of the Western Allies were under strict orders to treat Axis prisoners in line with the convention, something which generally occurred. Germany treated its British, French and American prisoners comparatively well, but treated Soviet, Polish and other Slavic prisoners of war with genocidal severity. Of about 5.7 million Red Army soldiers captured by the Germans, only about 2 million survived the war. More than 2 million of the 3.8 million Soviet troops captured during the German invasion in 1941 were simply allowed to starve to death. The prisoners of war in Japanese camps were generally accommodated in barracks and given mats to sleep on. The camps were encircled with barbed wire or high wooden fencing, and those who attempted escape would be executed in front of other prisoners. The majority survived on barley, green stew, meat or fish once a month and seaweed stew. Moreover, the prisoners did not receive the parcels from Red Cross. In German camps, the prisoners were stripped of their clothing and supplies. The German camps for Soviet POWs were mostly open ground. The German camps for Soviet POWs were mostly open ground, fenced with barbed wires and watchtowers. There would be no housing. Beatings and other abuse by the guards were common and prisoners were malnourished, often consuming only a few hundred calories per day. Medical treatment was non-existent and an International Red Cross offer to help in 1941 was rejected by Hitler. An instance of a camp mistreatment is Stalag 324, where once a week the sick inmates were to be shot. In the weeding out programs in 1941-42, the Gestapo further identified Communist Party and state officials, commissars, academic scholars, Jews and other undesirable or dangerous individuals who survived the commissar order elections and transferred them to concentration camps, where they were immediately summarily executed. By the end of the war, according to the historian Neil Ferguson, in addition to figures from Keith Lowe, the highest POWs died were Russian, held by Germans 57.5%, and the lowest were German POWs held by British 0.03%. Friends, let us now discuss the laws for the protection of POWs. Numerous international instruments were laid down to deal with treatment of prisoners, such as Geneva Conventions, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Let us discuss the Geneva Conventions. Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols, how they lay down the ground. The rules protecting the prisoners of war were first codified in the Geneva Convention of 1929. Following the World War II, they were refined in the Third Geneva Convention in 1949 and Additional Protocol of 1977. Under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war must at all times be humanely treated. Under Part 2, Article 12 of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war are considered to be the captives of the enemy power, not the individuals or military units who actually take them into custody. Moreover, they must at all times be protected, particularly against acts of violence or intimidation, and against insults and public curiosity. The government of the opposite power is held responsible for the treatment of prisoners of war. Under Part 2, Article 13, prisoners of war must always be humanely treated. Further, the captor has to treat their prisoners with respect and honor under all circumstances. It forbids any form of coercion to be inflicted upon the prisoner in pursuit of obtaining information of any kind whatsoever. No prisoner can be subjected to torture of any form. They cannot be physically mutilated nor be medically or scientifically experimented upon, which is on their best interest. No act or omission which can cause death or even endanger their life is lawful. More recently, Article 45 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, applicable to international armed conflicts, grants the protection of prisoner of war status to persons taking part in hostilities who fall in the power of an adverse party. According to Additional Protocol 2, similar protections are due to persons detained during non-international armed conflicts. Moreover, all wounded persons, whether or not they have taken part in armed conflict, shall be respected and protected, and no one should take advantage of their weakness in order to mistreat them or harm them in any way. In non-international armed conflicts, Article 3, common to the 1949 Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 2, provide that persons deprived of liberty for reasons related to the conflict must also be treated humanely in all circumstances. Friends, let us now discuss other laws. The section of Individual Rights and Responsibilities 1967 provides leadership within the ABA and the legal profession in protecting and advancing human rights, civil liberties and social justice in America. It addresses the issues under civil rights and ensures the protection of the individual's rights in the diverse and changing society. The UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, also abbreviated as SPT 2007, is one of another mechanisms of the United Nations directed to the prevention of torture and other forms of ill treatment. In 2002, European Convention for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment in Detention Places came into force. There are a number of other conventions and international treaties with provisions pertaining to the ethical treatment of prisoners of war, war refugees and others taken custody during wartime. A prominent example is the Agreement on the Gaza Strip and Jericho Agreement pertaining to prisoners of war around areas that have been in conflict with Israel. Few organizations such as ICRC, War and International Humanitarian Law and Stop POW Torture are dedicated to create awareness and protect prisoner of war laws. Let us now move to conclusion. Friends, in spite of gaining international recognition and codification, the prisoners captured have been mistreated, violating their rights. For instance, during the Korean War, the United States reported that North Korea mistreated prisoners of war. Soldiers were beaten, starved, put to forced labor, marched to death and summarily executed. In 1991, during the Persian Gulf War, American, British, Italian and Kuwaiti prisoners of war, which included mostly crew members of downed aircraft and special forces, were tortured by the Iraqi secret police. These were some of the examples that help you to understand the situation of prisoners of war during the recent times. Friends, with this, we come to the end of this module. I thank you all for your patient hearing.